It's a particular pleasure for me today to welcome our speaker, Dr. Grace Carrington, who's a colleague here um, as Honorary Research Fellow at the UCL Institute of the Americas, as well as a former postdoctoral researcher on the AHRC-funded collaborative research project called The Visible Crown, Elizabeth II and the Caribbean 1952 to the Present. In addition to her research on the project, some of which we're going to hear about this afternoon or this morning or this evening, depending on where you're joining us from, Grace has published on colonialism and grassroots protest movements in Guadeloupe and the Cayman Islands. And she's also recently published a monograph with Cambridge University Press entitled Global Decolonisation and Non-Sovereignty, Small Island States in the Caribbean, which was published in 2025. Her current book project, which we'll hear about in this session, explores republicanism and monarchy during decolonisation in the Caribbean. So it's with great pleasure that I hand over to Grace to speak on her paper tonight, which is called Caribbean Politics and the British Monarchy, Decolonisation, Republicanism and Reparations. So over to you, Grace.
Great, thanks. Hopefully everyone can see the slides okay. And yeah, thank you, Kate and Gad and Steve for organising this. And also thanks everyone who's joined today. As Kate mentioned, this presentation is based on a book I'm working on. So I'm really interested to hear any thoughts or questions you may have afterwards. So I thought I'd start just by giving a bit of context to the book. This comes from research I conducted as part of the Visible Crown project that Kate mentioned, which looks at the impact of Elizabeth II's reign in the Caribbean. And as you can see from the images here, questions about the monarchy's relationship with the Caribbean have become even more pertinent in recent years, since Barbados's shift to republic in 2021, and then in the following year in 2022 with those disastrous royal tours, as well as the increased attention on the need for the monarchy to engage in discussions about reparative justice. And within the Visible Crown project, my role was to focus on decolonisation and particularly looking at political debates about the monarchy in the run-up to independence. So to turn to the book itself, I'm going to cover 5 themes in the talk today, which roughly correspond to the 5 main chapters in the book. So I'll talk relatively briefly about the entrenchment of monarchy at the moment of independence. I'll go into a bit more detail about white minority power and the monarchy. I'll discuss things like land, petitions, and honours in relation to the monarchy, current and past campaigns for republics, and then depending on time, I'm going to also talk briefly about reparations and specifically in relation to the institution of the monarchy. The central argument of my book is that the endurance of the monarchy in the Caribbean is not simply a constitutional inheritance, but the product of deeper social and political structures formed during the colonial period. Throughout the reign of Elizabeth II, rather than functioning as a neutral or purely symbolic institution, the monarchy helped to stabilise and legitimise existing colonial structures, particularly those rooted in race, class, and economic inequalities. By providing a veneer of continuity, legitimacy, and constitutional order, it became part of the transfer of political power at independence, in which those underlying colonial systems of dominance remained fundamentally unchanged. Through its reputation as a guarantor of stability, impartiality, and respectability, the monarchy helped to reproduce racialized notions of political authority in the Caribbean. And this legacy persists in the continued reverence for the British honours system as a marker of legitimacy and prestige. Today, even in countries where public support for republicanism is becoming over 50% and is in the majority, constraints embedded in many Caribbean constitutions continue to entrench this colonial inheritance. In terms of my sources for the book, I've had to jump about quite a lot and use a real range of sources. References to the monarchy are often small mentions in the background rather than being at the forefront of political events or political debates. So I've used a range of archival sources in the Caribbean and the UK, including colonial reports and correspondence, intelligence reports, newspapers, things like oral history collections, as well as my own interviews with activists and politicians, and also political memoirs, biographies, and particularly parliamentary debates and speeches. And then in terms of the case studies that I've used for this book, I conducted research across the Caribbean, and I've really tried to include case studies that included a range of political statuses and different relationships with the monarchy. So I've included Dominica, which is the only country to become a republic on independence, Guyana and Barbados, which both became republics after independence. Also, the Bahamas, Belize, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in which the king is still currently the head of state. And then I've also included in my research the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, which, as British overseas territories, are not independent, and so they've retained the monarchy as well through those more formal constitutional ties that they have to the UK. So, to begin, I'm going to outline briefly how the institution of monarchy became embedded in the constitutions of most states, with the notable exception of Dominica. It's important to note that for many of the generation of Caribbean political leaders involved in the West Indies Federation from 1958 to 1962, retaining the Queen was seen as a natural and pragmatic part of this gradual transition to self-government. Following the Federation's collapse in 1962, both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago achieved independence while retaining the Queen as their head of state. And as they were the first former British colonies in the Caribbean to do so, their constitutions then became templates when drafting later independent settlements. And as Norman Girvan argues, this had the effect of embedding the core symbol of colonial governance into the institutions and rituals of the independent state. In my research, I examined the parliamentary debates and also the constitutional talks in the run-up to independence to get a sense of the political positions of the main parties at the time. And in most cases, the question of whether to retain the monarchy or not was not a central point of contention. In Barbados, for example, both major political parties largely accepted the monarchy as part of the island's inherited constitutional framework. And the main disputes that they had instead revolved around the timing of independence and also the issue of regional federation. Nonetheless, opposition did emerge, particularly from grassroots, intellectual and student movements, and this opposition is more visible in cases where public consultations took place around the time of independence. So, for example, in Jamaica, members of the West Indian Society for the Study of Social Issues at the University of the West Indies spoke out against this move of retaining the monarchy. And this included figures like Orlando Patterson and Norman Girvan, who would go on to form the New World Group. Similarly, and I've put some photos from archival sources in this slide. In 1979, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the socialist youth organisation ULIMO campaigned for a Republican constitution. You can see here the cover of their booklet on independence, and also a section where they specifically discuss becoming a republic. Despite these interventions, however, the monarchy was ultimately retained at independence, illustrating perhaps both the limits of dissenting voices, but also the broader consensus among political elites at the time around constitutional continuity. So, turning now to my second theme, which examines powerful white minority groups in the Caribbean and their relationship with the monarchy. I'm going to focus in this section specifically on Barbados, the Bahamas, and the Cayman Islands, because in these states, the white minorities continued to be influential in society and politics throughout the 20th century. These three case studies demonstrate that the monarchy served to legitimize and normalize white political and economic control in the Caribbean. Within societies that were highly stratified in terms of race and class, the monarchy formed the apex of these structures, in which proximity to whiteness and Britishness afforded greater wealth, power, and social status. Retaining the monarchy into the 21st century, as these three states all did, ensured that as greater political control was extended to the black majority, those colonial social structures and institutions which venerated whiteness and Britishness remained fundamentally unchanged. And thus, decolonisation is still very much an ongoing process. Barbados, firstly, is a country where these long-standing ties between the British monarchy and the white planter minority are very visible. Traditionally, Barbados advertised itself, particularly to tourists, as Little England, and this nickname refers to the fact that English settlers in the 17th century, through royal grants, established a colony in Barbados, which remained under British control throughout the colonial period, rather than swapping hands between different colonial powers, which was the case with many other islands in the region. The House of Assembly in Barbados is one of the oldest in the Western Hemisphere, and it was modelled on the Westminster system. It was in this parliament that the so-called Barbados Slave Code was enacted, creating what Hilary Beckles has referred to as the first Black Slave Society, a model that was then exported across the Americas. Notions of Barbados as having a long history of constitutional democracy form part of this Little England image, and they were a prominent part of those independence debates in the 1960s. The white minority in Barbados bought into this idea of Little England and Barbados's loyalty to the British monarchy because it served to legitimise their control of land, the economy, and the political scene up until universal suffrage in 1951. Universal suffrage and then independence have resulted in a gradual shift in white minority power. So, since independence, Barbados's white planter merchant class have maintained their monopoly on the economy and politically have shifted to influencing policy through lobbying and funding the major political parties. The 1966 Royal Tour, which you can see pictured in the first photo here, is a moment that really embodies the monarchy's relationship with white minority power in Barbados. In this image, the Queen's visit to her cousin's plantation is shown during that royal tour. And a similar picture to this from that visit is on the cover of Hilary Beckles' book on Reparations, Britain's Black Debt. The Queen's visit to Bell Plantation is a very out in the open demonstration of the monarchy's familial ties to that white Barbadian planter class, to the enormous wealth that they had acquired through enslaving Africans, and to that political and economic power that they continued to wield at the time of the tour in 1966. The campaign for a republic in Barbados has been quite protracted. So even when in 1998 the Constitutional Commission, the Ford Commission, called for a republic and both major political parties agreed in principle, it then took a further 20 years to achieve. And each time that the question of a republic came up, opposition was raised by white minority commentators or interest groups, and Tennyson Joseph refers to these interventions as, quote, latent expressions of white supremacy masquerading as innocent love for the monarchy, end quote. So in Barbados into the 21st century, monarchy functioned to delay and to restrict attempts at more transformative reform and decolonisation. Like Barbados, the white minority in the Bahamas had deeply embedded historical ties to the monarchy, and this was wielded in the 20th century as they tried to hold on to power. Most significantly for the Bahamas' relationship with the monarchy, some 8,000 loyalists fleeing from the American War of Independence resettled in the islands. And this tripled the population and greatly increased the proportion of enslaved people and also the scale of slavery across the islands of the Bahamas. Descendants of these loyalists then formed the backbone of the white minority class in the 20th century, who were known as the Bay Street Boys. And loyalty to the monarchy was a key dynamic in the way that they presented Bahamian history and also their position within society. Until black majority rule was established in 1967, the Bay Street Boys dominated politics, society, and the economy under a white segregationist government with which the British colonial state colluded. And this picture you can see here in this slide shows the statue of Queen Victoria that currently sits outside the House of Assembly in the Bahamas. It was commissioned in 1905 by the Imperial Order of Daughters of Empire, a white supremacist organisation that still exists but is not as prominent as it used to be. Thinking again about the Queen's visit in 1966, that big royal tour, for the Bahamas, this came during the final turbulent months of the struggle for black majority rule. So it was a really key moment in the timing of Bahamian history and local politics. And indeed, at that time, British intelligence reports were full of panicked rumours that the PLP, the Progressive Liberal Party, were planning to disrupt the royal tour, that there might be placards, protests, booing. In the end, however, they simply submitted a petition to the Queen requesting her help and support in establishing a more democratic electoral system. However, this petition was refused by the Secretary of State. It's unlikely then that the Queen ever read the petition, but she must have witnessed the reality of segregation in the Bahamas during her visit in 1966. Between the establishment of black majority rule in 1967 and then independence in 1973, the newly elected PLP government found themselves pressured on the one side by white international business interests who were keen to prevent any drastic change or any sense of nationalisation programmes, and from the other side by calls for more radical action, particularly from youth and student organisations inspired by Black Power activism in the region. In the end, the PLP opted to retain the monarchy on independence, as this was seen as signalling stability and continuity to reassure foreign investors at a time when many were fleeing and relocating to places like the Cayman Islands. So, turning then to the Cayman Islands, Cayman differs from Barbados and the Bahamas in that it did not become independent and it remains a British overseas territory. And interestingly, you can also see the political power of the predominantly white merchant class in Cayman lingering on much longer, partly as a result of this overseas territory status. In the early 1960s, there were attempts to disrupt the power of these merchants and to push for greater self-government. Ormond Panton and the National Democratic Party, the NDP, spearheaded this challenge, and in response, the merchant elite set up the Christian Democratic Party, the CDP, to try and block this effort. The CDP didn't really have any clear policies other than making loyalty to the Queen a really central point in their manifesto. And references to the monarchy can then be seen in key speeches and campaigns by the CDP. Ultimately, they were successful in blocking this move towards self-government. During this same decade, in the 1960s, in a real decade of thwarted political change in the Cayman Islands, Cayman was developing as an offshore financial centre. And the Queen was referenced repeatedly in articles and brochures advertising Cayman to investors and to tourists. Retaining a white British monarch as head of state served to reassure white investors of the perceived stability and international respectability of Cayman as an offshore financial centre. The Queen also had an even more direct relationship with offshore finance in the Cayman Islands than simply this symbolic role. So the Paradise Papers, which were leaked in 2017, revealed that the Queen's private estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, held investments in the Cayman Islands. And looking at this slide, I've included a couple of photos here of the 1994 royal tour of the Cayman Islands. And it's noticeable that you can see the scale of the crowds and the level of royal pageantry is perhaps much greater and grander than you might expect elsewhere in the Caribbean at this time in the 1990s. Polling suggests a higher degree of apathy towards the monarchy in much of the rest of the region by the 1990s. However, in the Cayman Islands, Caymanian identity remained rooted in loyalty to the Queen, and her visits were very popular. So, moving to the third topic of my presentation, focusing on notions of monarchical authority in the Caribbean. This includes more direct forms of intervention, such as when the monarch is petitioned to intervene in local affairs. And this section focuses on three key themes: land rights, petitions, and the British honours system. So, firstly, in terms of land, during the expansion of the British Empire, royal grants facilitated the expropriation and settlement of colonial land. The first white British settlers would take with them the laws of England that were effective at the time of settlement. And so, for many colonies, English common law applied, which deemed that all lands in the realm originally belonged to the sovereign, unless modified by new laws. And this meant that any unclaimed or public land in a colony would be considered Crown land by default. Through these laws, the monarchy provided and upheld the legitimacy and legal structure of white land ownership. The Queen was therefore often perceived as the final authority when it came to disputes over land, and moreover, the monarchy served to normalise British presence in the Caribbean and British control of land. In the mid-20th century, when land speculation and land alienation intensified across the region, the question of Crown lands became particularly significant. Areas which had been used as common land by local communities were sold off to neo-colonial development projects. And one prominent example of this is Freeport in the Bahamas, where Crown land was offered to an American businessman to establish a free trade zone. Similarly, the Bate Hill Agreement in the British Virgin Islands during the 1960s is another example of land alienation, as the colonial government attempted to sell off Crown lands to international developers. However, in this case, the project was halted by a local protest movement. Another dynamic of this monarchical authority is petitioning. So, petitioning the monarchy over the head of the local colonial government has a long history dating back to the petitions of enslaved people during the era of slavery. This phenomenon is also influenced by the mistaken association made between Queen Victoria and the abolition of slavery. Furthermore, after emancipation in many Caribbean colonies, the white upper and middle classes sought to promote a kind of cult of monarchy in order to strengthen cultural ties to Britain, to provide a sense of security in the uncertain times after the abolition of slavery. And this cult of monarchy is analysed in Moran Johnson's book, Neither Led Nor Driven, which looks at Jamaica in the 19th century after the Morant Bay Rebellion. The cult of monarchy was used to promote a feeling of stability and also to entrench race and class hierarchies in the late 19th and early 20th century. This process was facilitated by that existing sense of loyalty to Queen Victoria among many black working class groups in the Caribbean. This cult of monarchy strengthened the idea of the British monarch as an impartial, external authority figure who would intervene to carry out justice and to overall corrupt local political figures. Petitions to the monarch are part of this phenomenon, And throughout the 20th century, petitioners in the Caribbean sent their concerns to the Queen, particularly regarding land rights, self-governance, and also the use of the death penalty. Petitioning became a real source of concern for the Foreign Office during decolonisation, and considerable time was spent in devising protocol and policies to try to discourage petitions to the Queen. In many ways, the petitioning of the Queen contributed to the undermining of confidence in local leadership. Authority figures from outside the Caribbean, and especially the monarchy, were presented as more objective, more competent, and more legitimate. Finally, the way that the monarchy is associated with legitimacy and respectability was also apparent in the continued investment in and reverence for the British honours system. And Hamid Ghani argues that receiving a knighthood remains a gold standard in the Caribbean to which many people aspire. This honours system created a dynamic whereby recognition and acknowledgement of one's achievements and respectability had to be sought from Britain rather than this being provided from within the Caribbean itself. People who received honours from the British monarchy were able to buy in into a formal social hierarchy and feel part of an elite system. These examples I've mentioned highlight that monarchical authority in the Caribbean operated not only at a symbolic level, but also through tangible, legal, political, and social mechanisms. Whether through the structuring of land ownership, the practice of petitioning, or the conferral of honours, the monarchy functioned as a key site through which legitimacy and authority were defined and contested. And as such, monarchical authority was not simply inherited from the colonial past, but actively reproduced and reworked throughout the 20th century. So I now want to look at movements for republics in the region. Since independence, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and then more recently Barbados have all removed the monarchy as head of state and become republics. Dominica, as I mentioned, is the only nation in the English-speaking Caribbean to have become a republic at the moment of independence in 1978. And it's notable that in the other three cases, including Barbados, where countries removed the monarchy as head of state in the years after independence, this was accomplished through a parliamentary bill and not done through a referendum. For the remaining constitutional monarchies, only Belize has the ability to abolish the monarchy through the National Assembly, and the other 7 states need a referendum to make this kind of change to their constitutions. And you can see here in the slide, I've grouped those remaining 7 into 2 groups. So in Bahamas, Jamaica, and St. Lucia, a referendum would simply need to get over 50% in order to make the constitutional change required to become a republic. Whereas in St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, and Grenada, in all those 4 countries, there's a much greater constitutional bloc in that a 2/3 majority vote is required in order to make the transition to republic. And until now, only one country has attempted to make this move to republic via a referendum, and that was St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2009. And as I've outlined, they would need a 2/3 majority, but in this case, only 45% of voters chose to replace the Queen with a ceremonial president. So this fell far short of that 2/3 requirement. Since Barbados became a republic, political leaders in several Caribbean countries have indicated a wish to remove the Queen as head of state. Notably in Belize, Jamaica, and St. Lucia, constitutional change did have a degree of momentum behind it, with constitutional review committees assessing the possibilities of reforms. However, for various different reasons, in all 3 cases in these 3 states, the transition to republic doesn't appear imminent. Nonetheless, some critics of the British monarchy and its continued influence in the Caribbean argue that something more is needed than simply a symbolic change from monarchy to republic. And this is where we see calls for more drastic constitutional reform, as well as campaigns for reparative justice. So I'm aware of time, so I'll just finish by briefly discussing reparations and specifically calls for the British monarchy as an institution to engage in reparative justice. As the photos here indicate, um, during various royal visits in recent years, those royal tours in 2022, the tours were met with demands for the monarchy to engage in reparations. And given that the British monarchy has a long history of investment in and entanglement with slavery, campaigns for reparations have focused specifically on the royal family. Brooke Newman has a recent book out, The Crown's Silence, which outlines clearly the monarchy's historical links with slavery. And I think she's actually giving a talk to this seminar in a few weeks. When we look at other legacy institutions in the UK, different institutions such as Glasgow University have set up restorative justice schemes or started to engage in the process of reparative justice. And so there's an expectation that the monarchy ought to do the same. Constitutional reform, therefore, represents just one dimension of this broader reckoning, a continuing struggle to dismantle the material and ideological legacies of empire. So, I just want to conclude by highlighting that when brought together, these different case studies that I've talked about in the book emphasize the symbolic power, but also those more direct forms of monarchical authority that the British monarchy has wielded throughout decolonisation in the Caribbean. The monarchy functioned to give a veneer of stability and constitutional continuity while masking underlying race and class inequalities. Thus, the monarchy becomes part of this gradual decolonisation in which political suffrage and sovereignty is extended across society without fundamentally challenging those unequal institutions and structures embedded during colonialism and plantation slavery. While recent moves towards republicanism signal important shifts, they also highlight the persistence of these deeper structural inequalities that constitutional change alone will not resolve. Ultimately, the book argues that reckoning with the monarchy's historical and ongoing influence is crucial to understanding and potentially reshaping contemporary debates on sovereignty and decolonisation in the Caribbean. And I'll finish there. I've just, in this final slide, included a shameless plug to the previous book that I wrote that Kate mentioned before.
Thank you so much, Grace, for that excellent, wide-ranging analysis of all the many and various ways in which the monarchy has made its sort of constitutional, political, symbolic, and material presence felt within the Caribbean and the various implications of that. And that's a very beautiful book cover as well for your first book.
Thanks.
So I can see there is a question in the chat already, which I'll come to momentarily. Um, but I guess to just pick up on the last theme of reparative justice, which also links back to your one of your other themes on the honors system,
Mm,
and one of the slides you had on that statue of Victoria in the Bahamas.
mhm.
Um, to what extent would you say have those honor systems now been indigenized across the Caribbean, as it were, in terms of some changes that have been made to, I don't know, renaming them as national honors, some shifts in things like oaths of allegiance that used to be to, Her Majesty, her heirs and successors, etc. And maybe say something, if you can, on sort of statues debates and the bringing down of. I know that the statue of Victoria in Georgetown, Guyana, I believe, was dynamited by one by now I see Nigel Westbus is in the audience. He'll know better than I do, but I believe it was dynamited by Martin Carter and a friend outside the uh, uh, Houses of Parliament. So anyway, I'll let Nigel come in on that if he wants to. But yes, so ways in which oaths of allegiance or honor systems have been kind of reformed and ongoing statutes debates, just to start off with. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. Thanks. Um, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Queen Victoria statue in the Bahamas because I think there's now they've added or they were in process. I think they have now added an additional plaque just of information on that statue. Um, and in terms of oaths of allegiance, I know there's been various efforts across the Caribbean to have national honor systems, which kind of challenge that dynamic in terms of the seeking of sort of external validation through the British honor system. But my sense is that that's still kind of contested, and in some ways, I suppose, depending on how people feel about it, in some cases, the British honor system still retains a sort of or can retain an additional prestige. I suppose with all of this, it can seem purely symbolic to change oaths of allegiance or to change statues, but they do have a kind of deeper power and a cumulative effect of slowly changing all of those things that sort of contribute to that wider symbolic power that those symbols of monarchy can have.
Thank you. I see lots of raised hands. I'll go first to I'll merge the two questions in the chat since they're both from April Louise Pennant. So um, she thanks you for your talk and would like to hear about your positionality in terms of how that impacts your research, in terms of your field work, analysis, and writing it up. And then has a specific question on that. Um, organization you mentioned in relation to the Bahamas, I think it was, of the Daughters of the British Empire. And what's the correct name? What's the full name of that organization that you mentioned, which has that incredible name?
Yeah, thanks. They're both really good questions. To start, what I think about it, the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the British Empire, it was, I believe, started in Canada and then had various branches. And so this was the Bahamian branch that funded and put up that statue. But it was linked to the organization in Canada, and I believe there were various branches in other colonies across the British Empire, mostly in I think Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And in terms of positionality, that's a really good question. I think that's something I've grappled with throughout the project and throughout the research. Um, I imagine it definitely influences the gathering of research and the gathering of data in terms of interviews, if I'm interviewing someone, how they perceive me. And it's interesting in terms of, on the topic of monarchy, it was in joining the project, it was something I grappled with in terms of how deep my own interest or lack of interest there was within monarchy as a concept. And then I think uh, the the sort of renewed interest, campaigns for a republic, that kind of momentum since Barbados became a republic, has made it much more pertinent. And then also, I guess, in terms of talking about race and reparations, I guess I'm always aware that I'm a white person talking about it, and I'm not from the Caribbean, and I'm talking about it in the context of the Caribbean. Um, but in terms, I mean, I didn't have a lot of time to talk about reparations in this presentation, but I certainly think it's an important thing to talk about, and I think it's a really important aspect of talking about the monarchy in particular, because there's such a pushback and hesitation from the British monarchy and the royal family to sort of have an open conversation about it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Mike Hope to unmute and ask your question if you can.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. That was it was an incredible uh analysis covering, a number of quite diverse islands that are all united, of course, by the shame of slavery. But I've got a couple of questions. One more specifically about Barbados, but
Mhm,
it does bring up the whole question of reparations kind of more fully, which is I'm aware that a year or two back, a Tory MP, I think his name was Drax,
Mhm.
which is curiously a horrible name, but anyway, um, and he was outed as still living part-time on his family's plantation, which
Mhm.
had been, a slave-owning plantation and a sugar-producing plantation, and and the family are still making a lot of money out of it.
Mhm.
This may or may not be the relative of the Queen that you referred to. That not that family,
Well,
okay.
one.
But he I don't know whether he got voted out in. He represented somewhere in Dorset, I think. I
Mhm.
don't know whether he got voted out in 2024, but one might hope so. But he was curiously unwilling to give any ground at all, and somehow it had nothing to do with him, even though he was a material beneficiary of the proceeds of slavery and his whole family before him. And which brings me to the wider question. It's not just monarchy, it's successive premiers here in the UK have gone out of their way to say, oh, it's very unfortunate. But of course, that was a long time ago and nothing to do with us, really. And no way are we considering reparations, because reparations, of course, don't just come from individual families or indeed from the monarchy. The whole bloody city of London was built entirely upon money, originally paid to slave owners, which was only eventually repaid. The loan that the state took out to do it was only eventually repaid, I think, in the mid something like 2015.
Yeah, 2015.
But I think, you know, we really have to. The problem is not just the monarchy. That's the thing. I would assert that the problem is what I'd call the crown. And the crown are all the institutions of the British state and capital, which, assert power and also assert power here in the UK by the Act of Union, England's dominance over Wales and Scotland, not to mention Ireland, which, will hopefully very soon vote to become part of a 32 counties republic. So that's one whole thing. The other whole thing is just around, is there any kind of, you know, major intellectual within any of the countries of the Caribbean um, who's been able to make this a very powerful campaign? I'm thinking of CLR James, though I'm not aware that he especially did. I mean, he was from Trinidad, which, quite early became a republic. But, it needs somebody with a lot of charisma to be able to unite the core right across the Caribbean. I wonder whether there was such a person.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it's a really good question. In your second question, um, in terms of kind of uniting a campaign, are you talking more specifically there about movements for republics or reparations specifically?
Both.
Both, yeah. No, that's yeah, really good questions. In terms of, I think someone has commented in the comments it's Drax was a different plantation. It was Bell Plantation that Queen Elizabeth visited in 66, which is I think it's the Lascelles family. Um, and there's a section in Hilary Beckles' book that talks about that family, their links to the royal family and how they made their wealth. That was Bell Plantation. Um, it's interesting when you think about the monarchy and whether, as an institution, it would be possible to sort of separate it from the British state in terms of looking at reparative justice. Um, it's made more complicated by the sort of difficulties with research, the difficulties, gaining access to all those documents that would show those direct links that you might use to build up a legal case, say. Um, I know Brooke Newman, who I mentioned, has sort of laid this out really clearly in her book, but also had difficulties accessing sources. Um, and the other thing I think that's interesting in the case of the royal family is that sort of attempt to present it as a family, as this kind of cozy family separate from the sort of financial side. Um, which makes me think of a book by Laura Clancy that's really good. I think it's called The Family Firm, but it kind of looks at that in terms of the modern monarchy, of that attempt to separate, to present this cozy family front and separate that from the sort of institution, the history, the financial side, and then also in terms of slavery. And then in terms of your question about building a campaign. In terms of republics, the one thing I'd say that's really difficult that I touched upon is that question of a referendum, particularly if you're in a state like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where you need more than two-thirds majority in a referendum. That makes it really difficult to kind of build political consensus in order to get past that threshold. Referenda are generally historically quite dicey for political leaders, so that makes it sort of less incentive to drive a referendum. Often it becomes a question of the sort of popularity of whichever leader is pushing that referendum campaign. So it can be really difficult to build consensus. And I think it's interesting that in the case of Barbados, there was that big gap that I mentioned from the uh, from the Reform Commission, kind of general consensus that Barbados wanted, the political leaders wanted to move towards a republic, and then quite a delay in implementing it. And I think any country, which is, any remaining country other than Belize that needs a referendum, that makes it so much more difficult. In terms of reparations, there certainly feels like there's a kind of building consensus and building momentum, both in terms of within the Caribbean leaders themselves, in terms of partnerships with African countries, and then also in terms of the Reparations Committee in the UK Parliament itself. So there's a sort of growing growing movement, I suppose. In terms of academics, I mentioned Hilary Beckles. I suppose that's the obvious example in terms of his book, Britain's Black Debt, and also his campaigning. Yeah.
Thank you, Grace. I'll just round up a few of the comments and then I'll go to Gad for his question. Yes, indeed. Thank you to Jess Morency for mentioning the Drax of Drax Hall book by Paul Lashmar. So for those of you that want to follow up on the Drax theme, and I know that Steve, who's also here, has been is quite knowledgeable on the whole connections between Drax, the Tory MP, and back those campaigns in the Caribbean around the Drax plantation. We have a wonderful comment from Nigel to my query about whether the blowing up the Victoria statue was apocryphal in Georgetown, and he says indeed that the story goes, where is it? I've lost the comment. The story goes that it was indeed Martin Carter and Nigel's own uncle, um, allegedly involved in that, but no one was ever prosecuted for it. And he includes a link to a Facebook post about that, which is great. Thank you for that, Nigel. Um, and yes, indeed, a couple of times now, Brooke Newman's name has been mentioned, and indeed in 2 weeks' time, so on the let me get it. It is the 20th of May, so 2 weeks from today. We will indeed have Brooke Newman speaking about her new book, The Crown's Silence. So you can go onto the UCL Institute of the Americas webpage now, find the details of that, and register in advance. So we'll have a kind of monarchy theme this couple of seminars, so we can hear about those links that she has made in terms of the monarchy and enslavement and reparations. Um, Gad, sorry, you've been waiting patiently. Go ahead.
That's okay. Grace, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. Very wide-ranging and really quite fascinating. And what struck me, there are many things, but along with others, I'm sure. But you talked about the impediments
Mm,
to becoming republics. Some did it right away, others not. And you talked about the various percentages that are required. But if you take, and it wasn't the place you concentrated on, but if you take Jamaica as an example of a place that, has been talking about it for a very long time, and yet it hasn't happened, and yet has a very distinct, I would even say radical political tradition, then I'd be interested to know if you think Jamaica and other countries like it, um, um, what explains the
mm.
delay in their adopting this?
Yeah. Um, yeah, it is. Jamaica's an interesting one. It looked like there was a degree of momentum. They would need to hold a referendum and would just need over 50%. Polling kind of suggests it. So I've seen it move between sort of 50 to 55% in favor of becoming a republic. So um, that would suggest that they might be able to push it over the line. I think with all these things, it's often that difficult case of balancing the amount of costs involved, the sort of seeming, does it seem like purely something symbolic and therefore, for example, in the case of Jamaica, if you're recovering from hurricane, understandably, all of the sort of attention and focus goes into
Uh-huh.
to that kind of recovery, and therefore a more symbolic change appears kind of frivolous when you're trying to deal with other issues. Interestingly, some of the um, polling that was done as part of the wider project showed that familiarity and also political education had a big impact. So, in the case of Barbados, the popularity of a republican system was much higher once Barbados had become a republic and people were familiar with it, whereas prior to that transition, people didn't know necessarily what it was, and so it was sort of less popular. And then also, I think certainly in much of Cynthia Barrow Giles' work on constitutions, she talks a lot about political education, and that's come out from that polling that the more people are aware and understand about the systems of monarchy and republic, then momentum and popularity tend to increase.
Hmm.
I guess it's that sense of kind of apathy about it that makes it difficult to change.
Great. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Yes, I think if I remember rightly, one of the interesting results from one of Cynthia's polls was the one in Barbados, where what you'd maybe expect this correlation that those who had tertiary degrees were more pro or the more education you had, the more pro-Republican you were, I think it was, but
Mm.
also that older voter, which you might not expect. Oh, you might go in there expecting, oh, the older generation are going to be more sympathetic to the monarchy or have, fond memories of Elizabeth II or whatever. But in fact, it was the older generation who, in that Barbados poll, who were more pro-republic.
Mm.
Um, uh, there are more comments which I will come to in the chat, but I want to go to John Tumman's question, who's also been waiting patiently there.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the presentation, Grace. I've got four questions. Um, but first of all, I've never been to the British Caribbean, although I have been to the Caribbean twice, once to Guadeloupe, which is part of France, and just before Christmas to Cuba, which is
Mhm.
also not British. But a few things occur to me. One thing is, did the do you think that the fact, and did you look at this, that there was a demand for immigrants from the British Caribbean in the 1950s? Um, Adverts went all over the British Caribbean from the NHS and so on when Enoch Powell actually fronted that campaign, something not a lot of people recognize. Um, did that play a part in adhering the loyalty of the population? Because certainly the impression given was that when people from the British Caribbean came over here in the 1950s and the 1960s, they had often fought for Britain in the Second World War, and they did seem more loyal to Britain than the indigenous Britons. But I wonder if that played a part in delaying the kind of blooming of republicanism in the Caribbean. That's my first question. The second one is whether an ethnic or racial, whatever you want to call it, breakdown has ever been done of the different islands in the Caribbean, of the degree of Republican sentiment. Obviously, the proportion of the white population varies between those islands. So, but it might be interesting if anything like that has been attempted. My third question is who set I missed that bit, who set the 66%? Um, and what reason is there now to adhere to it? Who is policing it? Who is insisting that it be followed? And finally, in terms of the campaign in this country on reparations, has this been linked in the campaigning material to the repayments to the 45,000 descendants of the slaveholders, which has spanned almost two centuries,
Mhm.
and the vast amounts of money that were given to them? Because whenever reparations is discussed in the public realm and in the media, those two things are never linked,
Mm.
which seems to be missing a trick as far as I can see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think to start with your question about the repayment, I have seen it in certain cases. I've certainly seen more in perhaps academic discussions of people making that clear link in terms of the centuries that it took to pay off that debt in the UK going up to 2015 and using that as as a way to kind of make a clear link in terms of reparations. Um, and certainly the UCL project that has traced all of those documents, all of the families, and also quite clearly mapped across the UK the spread of where that money went to slaveholders at abolition. There's quite a lot of research there, but as you mentioned, often in I guess more kind of media discussions, it is not always raised when it's such a clear link. Um,
What about this House of Commons or parliamentary committee that you or someone mentioned about reparations? Do they make the link?
I think they must do. I'm sure someone in the comments would know the full title. Um, it's a committee. It's been running, I think, since maybe 2021 certainly I remember attending the first committee meeting that was online. So I think that was during the pandemic. Um, and people did bring up in the committee meeting um, the payment that was made to slave owners. So yeah, I can't remember the full title of the committee. Um, in terms of you mentioned who set the 66%, the two-thirds requirement. Um, it would have been done for a lot of states. There would be a kind of draft constitution drawn up in collaboration between the government in that state and also the British government. And then often it was a sort of 1 or 2 day conference in London to quickly go through any points of contention, usually attended by the party in power and the opposition party. In terms of the 66%, I think it was often suggested as being a way to ensure security and stability. It's interesting when you look at the lists of countries that have that requirement for two-thirds majority. Most of them are two island states, so like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis. So it was often put in, I think, with the idea of it gives stability, but also obviously with the idea of stability, you're preserving the status quo, and so it's the stability of inequality in effect, and it therefore makes reform very difficult. But it would have been during those constitutional talks that it was drawn up. And as I mentioned, usually the sort of framework was from a previous constitution, often Jamaican or the Trinidad and Tobago constitution. Uh, Another question about race and monarchy, and I haven't seen any polling that specifically separates the popularity of the monarchy according to race. I suppose anecdotally, in Barbados, certainly from discussions I've heard and from sort of media coverage, there is perhaps, or there was perhaps a greater popularity amongst white Barbadians, but I'm generalizing there. Um, and then in terms of immigration, it's interesting when you think about that experience of migration. In my own research, more generally, I would say that people I've spoken to have talked about the experience of migration from the Caribbean. I'm sort of whether talking about French Caribbean or British Caribbean as more of often a moment of making connections to other people, international connections, perhaps if people go as students, connections with other students, perhaps students from the wider British Empire, and often that's that experience of migration, the experience of Britain, of racism, often pushes people into action rather than necessarily creating like a greater loyalty to Britain or yeah, or delaying that move to republic. I think in terms of thinking about that built up sense of loyalty to Britain, you can perhaps more clearly see it if you look at the first half of the 20th century, in terms of the pushes for the way education was rolled out in the British Caribbean, people encouraged to sing God Save the Queen every day, kids encouraged to wave flags at royal visits, and that kind of education system that really pushed British history. I'd say that perhaps pushed more those messages of kind of loyalty and respectability in the Caribbean, perhaps than that experience of migrating. Yeah, does it answer those questions?
Yes, it does. And thank you very much for that. Um, I was trying to, I was thinking more
Mm,
of the 1950s and
yeah.
the early 60s, which was the period of migration
Mm,
into Britain,
yeah.
and the attitudes then as a delaying mechanism. But I entirely agree with you. I mean, the experience of racism in Britain and more recently the experience of people being forcibly repatriated by the state who are long-term residents here because they had never bothered because they didn't know about it and they weren't told to regularize their status. Those things leave are sour in people's experience and people with relatives, and there's a lot of people with relatives in the British Caribbean who've been through that recent experience of British racism. Certainly, the message that they would be relaying back would not be the one that I was referring to.
Mhm.
Okay, I can see there's lots of hands are still going up and there's lots of comments in the chat. So I'm going to relay some of the comments in the chat to give Grace a little pause, and then I'll come back to the people whose hands are up. So April Louise had indeed made reference to the 46,000 claimants for the loss of, quote, enslaved property in the Caribbean, um, um, such that, as we know, it wasn't just the crown that benefited, but ordinary and even working class people. And I think we've already mentioned the UCL Legacies of Slave Ownership database, which is now the UCL Legacies of Slavery project. And I've put a link into the chat where you can go onto that database, which has the, this done all of this amazing work of tracing exactly where that money went. And you can look at the maps and hover your cursor over locations in the UK where that quote unquote compensation money was paid, and as well as to the planters in the Caribbean. So I'd encourage everyone who hasn't already used that resource to look at that UCL Legacies of British Slavery website. So thank you, April Louise, for drawing our attention to that. Um, there's a question from J. Kennedy Cruikshank about whether you can say more on reparation efforts to get it through. I think we have begun that conversation on reparations already, so I'm just going to put a pin in that for now and come back to that. And oh yes, we have a piece of information from Gabriel Coutu, who was has done a quick check of the Order of the Daughters of the British Empire Canadian connection. So that is now in the chat, where they still apparently have an official website.
Yeah.
We have a comment from Mike Hope about wouldn't the money from reparations be useful in rebuilding after the hurricane? We can group that together under reparations questions, which we can come to. And then, yes, I've just drawn attention to, we've been referring quite a lot to polling. So the poll that was done by Cynthia Barrow-Giles and her team at Cave Hill um, uh, for the Visible Crown project, that polling is up on that website and lots of other resources, including an excellent short piece by Grace on the that lays out the constitutional requirements, so that constitutional threshold she's been talking about for what is needed to be done in each case to remove the monarchy. And the region-wide polling that was done by that for that project by Cynthia and her team. Some of the talks of results of polling for individual countries have been given by Cynthia in the Caribbean. Some of those have been recorded and should be online on UWI's website. And ultimately, all the results of that polling will go up onto the Visible Crown website. So sort of watch this space, and we should perhaps organise more events around to discuss the outcome of that latest poll. So that is, let me see if I got, oh, we want a link to the Institute of the Americas. Yes, I can do that. Okay, so I think that I've covered the chat now. Who did I see next? Steve Freeman, then Steve Cushion, and then Luke. So Steve
Yes,
Freeman.
thank you, Kate, and also obviously thank you to Grace. It was a really interesting and provoking talk. I'm a supporter of a group called the Republican Labour Education Forum. So, I mean, after this, we'd love to see if we could invite Grace to come and speak to us. That's a separate thing. But my question was this: I'm wondering whether, in terms of getting rid of a monarchy and having a republic, do you have, as opposed to simply a party having a referendum as a bullet point, as it were, in its programme, is there anything that you could call a Republican Party? That is to say, a party that sets out to win public opinion and with the idea of a republic, and maybe connect it to social or economic reform, and say land reform, and sort of appeal to people on that basis. And that's a much stronger basis than simply saying, well, perhaps we'll have a referendum, and leaving it a question of something marginal and not really fundamental to some transformation of those societies. Are there any what you might call Republican parties in the Caribbean? That's my question.
Yeah, it's difficult because of that kind of Westminster system legacy. The system in most countries is set up to have a two-party system, and it can be incredibly difficult for a party outside those two main parties to break through in terms of sort of funding, generating momentum, political power in general. That can be really difficult to crack. So I think it tends to, in the cases where countries became republics, the sort of formal moment of pushing through the National Assembly came from one of the main parties. However, if you look at, say, Trinidad and Tobago, which is not one of my main case studies in the book, but certainly if you look at when Trinidad and Tobago became a republic, that came off the back of a huge amount of grassroots Black Power protests, and kind of wider different community groups and pressure groups pushing for change. But the party that sort of took it through Parliament was one of the main political parties.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And go ahead, Steve Cushion.
Yes, just in a little bit of a comment on what John previously said about the campaign for reparations in Britain, and the question of the how long it took to pay back the compensation in 2015. I mean, the media do not report this because they have no interest in this. Even The Guardian, that bears its heart, on its sleeve for this, has no interest in this. But the reparations movement at a grassroots level, I mean, Caribbean Labour Solidarity, Global African Congress, the RMT's Black Workers section, we've stood outside, we stand in Westminster fairly often shouting about this. Now, I know that ain't much, but it is something that is, it is very much part of the campaign for reparations in this country. And the fact that the newspapers don't report it shouldn't surprise anyone in this room, really. But what I really wanted to ask was about, you mentioned Crown land being alienated to international developers. And
Yeah.
kind of, as a historian, to me, this kind of goes back to after 1838. They did their best to make sure that land could only, could only be bought by people who had an awful lot of money, and to prevent any kind of return to small farming and so on. And I was just, and I kind of thought, oh, that was in the past, really, wasn't it? I didn't realise that they were still using this crown prerogative of land to make sure that money, that the land stays with moneyed interests, rather than going in any sense to the people, because obviously still to this day, the last thing they want is ordinary people being able to subsist without working for the man. So I just, if you could say a little bit more about this question of crown land.
Yeah.
And just to say, I may be in touch with you later to get some references. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, I sort of touched upon it, but I feel like there's so much more I could have said. The two examples I gave, so Freeport in the Bahamas, which was sold off, and then the other example was the Bait Hill Agreement, which was in the British Virgin Islands, and would have involved the selling off of a large part of the island of Anegada, and then also part of the capital on Tortola. And in both those cases, there was that sort of further dynamic of it was white international business interests buying up that land with the intention of restricting access to that land, often importing white workers from other countries to work and restricting access to that land, which was often common land, to local people, and particularly to Black people on the islands. In the case of Freeport in the Bahamas, that went ahead, and it's interesting the timing. It was before Black majority government came in 67, and then that was quite a key point of contention for the Pindling government when they came in. And as Bahamas became independent, in terms of grappling with immigration policies, and trying to stop land alienation and also stop that phenomenon where white workers were imported to work in the Freeport, in the free trade area, and Black workers from the Bahamas didn't have access to those areas or those jobs. And that was part of the Bahamianization programs that Pindling brought in to sort of try and tackle that. But Freeport still to this day is owned by a business rather than the government of the Bahamas. There's a sort of relationship there. In the case of the British Virgin Islands, there was a big protest movement, a very successful protest movement that prevented that land. It forced the British government to reverse that sale of land. And so to this day, British Virgin Islanders still have access to that main part of the capital, and it's still partly owned by local people. So yeah, there's an interesting counterpoint, those two examples. And then in terms of reparations, and the campaign for reparations in the UK, yeah, it's a hard one. I'm obviously talking specifically about the case with the monarchy, partly because the scope of the project and the book is about the monarchy. I also wonder whether there is more scope to push um, for a sort of swifter or more successful push for reparation with institutions. So specifically, like the institution of monarchy. Obviously, that's aside from thinking about the logistics of it and the sort of approach of the monarchy and the royal family, um, but just thinking about successful uh, studies and pushes and schemes of reparative justice, like I mentioned, Glasgow University and some other institutions. It sort of seems like logistically there is more scope there, aside from the kind of politics of trying to push the British government to engage in reparations, and the sort of more political difficulties there. Um, yeah, it would be interesting to see as this kind of grows. I spoke to people in the reparations committees in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and also in Dominica. And it's interesting in Dominica, the kind of approach of the committee in terms of looking at Indigenous rights, Indigenous land rights, and those abuses that occurred that there are sort of very clear legal documents to build up that kind of legal case. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in that case. And as far as I know, that case is directly at the British government in the Dominica case.
Thank you. What you were saying there, Grace, about the private ownership and land, etc., just reminded me of Mustique being bought in 58 by that British aristocrat, and then him gifting 10 acres of land on Mustique to Princess Margaret, sister of Elizabeth II, and then it's now been changed into the Mustique Company. So these kind of royal tentacles are just everywhere. I'm going to give the last question to Luke, and if because we've been working, Grace, very hard, and it's 4 minutes to the end. So if I can ask you to keep your question and answer succinct. Thank you, Luke.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And thanks, Grace, for a really rich presentation. And I just wanted to make a few comments. I think on the question of the royalty and how, they've managed to try and brainwash people really into feeling that monarchy is so important. And we know it plays a similar role here in the UK, in terms of keeping people at a level of believing that, there's some born to rule and so on. And how that influences people. But I think that can probably change in a very quick time, really, regarding, what's happening to the scandals in the monarchy at the moment. And certainly with this question about reparations, we see things that can change very quickly. And coming back to reparations, I think that movement also is growing worldwide because more and more people are becoming aware of it. I should mention that I'm president of Caribbean Labor Solidarity, and we've been actively working with trade unions, especially in this country, to raise people's awareness, because we think it's important that we got to put pressure on the government. And although there's some movement towards some of the areas of slavery, actually making apologies and making reparations, we think is important that that comes from the British government, and that they talk and sit down and talk to the Caribbean leaders who've been calling for this discussion for some time now, which, as you know, the different governments have been resisting. But we think that will come at some point. In the Caribbean, people are beginning to see as well that there needs to be more radical approach to the politics, and there's been more calls for federation. I've just come back from Trinidad and was pleased to hear some people mention federation, and even some of the islands that are still not independent talking about the independence movements as well. So we think, with the new push from the Donald in America in trying to revive the Monroe Doctrine will certainly sharpen some minds about how we need to be moving more in terms of republicanism and so on. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And it's interesting you mentioned the current scandals. And yeah, it'll be, as you said, things can change quickly, and it'll be interesting to see the kind of longer impact in with the British public. I think recent polling suggested that the monarchy's popularity has dropped quite a bit. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
So I've just realized that I skimmed over. Marcia had a comment earlier, which I in flicking through the chat didn't see, what she was asking about why not look at Bermuda. So she's added to that saying Bermuda's important to have a look at, given Charles's recent visit, his speeches there. So I know that in writing a book, you certainly can't include everything. So
Yeah.
I can see how this project could expand ever outwards if you didn't keep it somehow contained. Um, but I think we've seen what a great project it is in the amount of questions that Grace's excellent paper has raised. She covered everything from the slave code in Barbados right up to the Panama Papers and to reparations today. So thank you so much, Grace, for that. And thank you to everyone in the audience for all of your excellent questions and contributions to this debate, which we're going to continue in 2 weeks' time with Brooke Newman's presentation on the Crown's silence. So I hope that many of you will be able to return in 2 weeks' time. And thank you again. And can we thank our speaker properly with our un applauso grande for a great paper. And thanks again to everyone for giving us your time.
Thanks.
Well done. Very good.
Oh, Corbinus raised his hand.
Yeah, great.
Quick, go for it. Go for it.
Very, very quickly. In 79, the revolution in Grenada, a decision to maintain the monarchy as the head of state. And so theoretically, it was Her Majesty's People's Revolutionary Government. Never understood why this occurred, but it was. If you remember, there was a big kerfuffle about the Governor General being kidnapped by American forces when they invaded. And in subsequently conversations with the revolutionaries, those that were alive, you ask why did this happen? And it was felt to be strategically important that this took place. So here is something, if you like, for the trivial pursuit people, where we actually went against the call for becoming a republic. In fact, in the manifesto of the New Jewel movement, there was a call for a republic, but in the reality of politics at the time, it was felt to be more protective of the revolution, that it be part of the Commonwealth with the Queen as head of state.
Yes, revolutionary government. That's excellent.
Nigel, you want to slip one in? Grace is not obliged to answer.
No. I made a mistake by clapping. I raised my hand instead of clapping for the.
Good. Okay, thanks. I do that myself. I get confused with where those little icons are at the bottom of the screen.
This clock is entering.
So
Subtitles on.
good. Yes. Is Corbinus still there? I had a similar experience of asking surviving revolutionaries precisely that question about the maintenance of the Queen as head of state, and indeed them saying, looking slightly sheepish and embarrassed, but then saying yes, it was seen kind of one, not a priority, and then two, as you say, a sort of strategic and tactical decision. not that it prevented them from being invaded
I was
in the
going,
end.
I was going to say it didn't work, did it?
No.
I spoke to Bobby Clark in Barbados, and similarly, he said something similar. Yeah, and it just makes me think if only I could the book could be twice as long. There are so many interesting examples.
Yeah. Well, you've struck a very rich vein, and we will all look forward to the book, and we will invite you back whenever it's out. So, because clearly this is a debate that's ongoing and that people are enthusiastic to contribute to. So, thanks everyone for staying the course.